Let's start off looking at some film of the great man Andrew Scull in action.
The whole question of how we decide who's mad and who's sane, and if you're mad, what kind of madness you've got, has long been something that's preoccupied people. And in the 19th century, when I began working in this field, it seemed as though almost every asylum superintendent came up with his own set of labels, and it was only a him in those days. There were any number of different versions of mental disorders that one could suffer from, and none of them really were very important, in part because they weren't very practical. One of the big problems with the diagnostic system is if it remains at the level of theory and you can't, in practice, apply it very easily, it's not very useful to you. And that really, when we see DSM-3, meaning the third edition, that reminds us there'd been two earlier ones. And there had been a DSM-1 and a DSM-2. And they were very tiny. The first one was about 100 pages, the second one about 130 pages, or about 100 different diagnoses you could be given, most of them with some kind of psychoanalytic gesture towards where they came from. DSM, very few psychiatrists used these things or had any regard for them. Psychoanalysis didn't have much time for broad categories. It was interested in the specifics of the psychodynamics of the individual case. So DSM-2 cost $3.50, and most psychiatrists thought it wasn't worth that much. DSM-3 is a whole different animal. When it was brooded, the psychoanalysts couldn't really care, and they made a fatal mistake, in my view. When the task force was set up with Spitzer as its director, they thought it was a non-event. They had one person on the task force who drew no respect from his colleagues and soon stopped it.
What you saw in this clip was Scull talking about the new DSM in 2012, expressing some of his deep concerns about the relationship between its disease categories and mental illness. It's a very typical Scull performance that derives from long-standing beliefs about the nature of psychiatry, and it's those beliefs that I'm about to elaborate in more detail. To understand the different positions that I'm about to elaborate, we have to return to this period when moral therapy was born, and then we have to go back to the asylums, which I spent a long time exploring in the first lecture. So just to remind you, we have the legend of Pinel and Chirurgi, the chains being taken off, the fetters released from the mad women at the Salpêtrière. We see a system where reason was targeted through the emotions rather than targeting the body in devices like Cox's swinging chair. We see the emergence of private asylums like the Retreat, madhouses established for the wealthy clientele at places like Ticehurst, places designed to remove the individual from the everyday stresses of life and to reorder their existence. And we see as well legislation that gradually enables the creation of large public institutions, and there are a series of acts passed in the 19th century that I'll look at in a moment. And again, to recap, at Hanwell and at a number of other asylums, individuals like Connolly abolish all restraints and introduce the balls and entertainments. We can see some of this legislation here. In 1808 in Britain, an act empowered local magistrates to order building asylums where necessary, and a few were built. In 1815 to 1816, a new commission uncovers the horrendous conditions in Bedlam. Think William Norris. The suggested reform bills are defeated, but the construction of large-scale asylums is mooted seriously. And in 1849, we see the appointment of an inspectorate. An effective framework is enacted, and by then, many counties like Middlesex had built or were building large asylums. Now, as soon as they built these places, they started filling up. In fact, filling up so quickly that very soon, very few beds were left. We can see this on this graph, taken from Scull's book, The Most Solitary of Afflictions. an incredible expanding population. Now, Skull has an explanation that gets us to the heart of his thinking about madness and its treatment. He believes, for example, that there was a possible small deployment from the workhouses, which were the institutions built to hold the indigent, people that couldn't get a job and didn't have any support networks in society. And the official statistics had stated that there had been a lot of these, but he reckoned by his analysis that this was not the case. The increasing demand that we've just seen is not the result of an increase in insanity. Indeed, the rapid increase in the number of asylums and therefore the number of beds for the mentally unwell, poorer families are given the opportunity to remove troublesome relatives from the domestic sphere to the new asylums. Indeed, Scull would argue, the industrialisation of society, which has been running apace since the 18th century, demands that this is so. As he said, asylums were largely receptacles for the confinement of the impossible, the inconvenient, and the inept. Note, nowhere in this are the mad, the insane, the lunatics. Skull was therefore putting forward an idea that looks suspiciously like he doesn't believe that conditions of mental illness exist, rather just a situation where economic, cultural, and social factors come together to produce a class of people that need to be dealt with because they just aren't productive within contemporary society. And certainly that's the way that many people have taken his point of view. Skull himself is absolutely adamant that mental illness exists. He's just not very keen on the idea that mental distress has an underlying biological pathology that can be identified. And we see this coming out in his work time and time again. Work like Madhouse, the story about Henry Cotton that he wrote, and more recently his commentary on the DSM. Now, none of this seemed very far removed from Foucault's thesis that I outlined in the last module. Indeed, Madness and Civilization put a great weight on the emergence of capitalism and industrialization and the impact that had in needing to create places that could deal with specific forms of deviance. It comes then as something of a surprise, perhaps, to see the virulence with which the new edition of Foucault's History of Madness was met by Andrew Scull. There are bad reviews, and there are bad reviews, and this is a really bad review. Scull is excoriating in his condemnation of Foucault's scholarship. The choices of the texts that he makes, the texts that he doesn't choose, the way that he glides over important events, selecting his own arbitrarily chosen ideas of what was important about the development of ideas around the treatment and diagnosis of madness. All the same, it seems quite extraordinary that the thesis of the one is so similar to the thesis of the other. Ultimately, it is Foucault's failings as a historian that are being critiqued here, not his overall thesis. Andrew Scull's first book came out during the 1970s, and it was on the subject of decarceration, the dismantling of the asylums. And from there, he went on to spend the rest of his career, or at least his career up until the early 2000s, focused almost exclusively upon the asylum regime. The important thing for us to remember is how deeply influential Scull has been. It was him, in combination with Foucault, the man whose scholarship he so derided, who set the agenda for social historians. It was an agenda that was going to be questioned by Edward Shorter, who is the subject of the next module.